Hi, I'm Don. Welcome to our studio. Today we have another unboxing video. Today we're unboxing and reviewing a couple of wet palettes from Army Painter. First, we unbox the classic Army Painter wet palette. The classic wet palette from Army Painter is cute. I found it really cute because it's smaller than what I'm used to. I like the look of the wet palette. It looks really nice, sturdy, durable, and how do I say this? It looks masculine. It looks manly. I don't know how to explain it, but it looks really cool. To be honest, I don't use the straps in wet palettes because I don't really mind changing the paper when I do another painting session. Basically, I don't care if the paints are usable the next day because I simply change the paper. So the chamber or the insert that houses brushes is really neat. Also, it you could remove it and just use the black parts together because they fit together really well. So if you don't need the chamber with the brushes, you could do so. So you'll have a thinner wet palette without the maroon chamber. Now you get a couple of foam pads, but you only need to use one, and then you get like 50 sheets of wet palette paper. I prefer bigger wet palettes because I'm a messy paint mixer. And I do a lot of glazes, meaning I thin down the paints and I need a lot of space. So for most people, I think this size, this wet palette is perfect. But for me, this is a little bit too small. Now, the size of the new Wargamers Edition is perfect. Oh, by the way, watch until the end of the video as we test this Wargamers Edition wet palette. Also, a ton of thanks to Adam and of course the Army Painter for sending me these palettes for review. Basically, the Wargamers Edition is a giant version of the classic wet palette. But other than the size, you get a really cool insert in the middle. Like the insert for the classic wet palette is just a chamber for your brushes. This one, it's like you have mixing wells or a mixing dish. It's not a dish, but mixing wells for your Army Painter speed paints and washes. But you do get the same foam pads, a couple of foam pads, and of course, 50 sheets of paper. However, this Wargamers edition is not only bigger, it's chunkier. It's really thick because of the insert. I really like the construction or like the quality of the plastics and the materials of both the classic and this Wargamers edition. Both has like the same quality, very nice plastic. It feels durable, and like I said earlier, it looks like it looks masculine. It looks very manly. It's black after all, and you have a really nice deep red strap. The cap or the cover snaps pretty nicely on top of the insert, and it's really stiff and nice. And the insert, the mixing wells, I did not expect the wells to be this deep. Like you could mix a lot of washes or custom paints or glazes or even speed paints on this. That's why it's thick. It's like the wells are deeper than any mixing dish I have ever used. I really like the plain black look of like the cover, and it's so nice. I don't want to put stickers on it because I like the look of the plain black cover. Now let's talk more about the mixing wells or the dry palette. It has a nice engraving, not engraving, it's not engraved, it's embossed like Wargamers edition on the side. It fits a lot of brushes and it's pretty big actually. And as like I said, the wells are really deep, which is just super good, especially if you're painting an army. The mixing wells are a little bit too much if you're painting just one miniature. The foam. The foam is actually thinner than I expected, and I was worried because it was folded when I got it from the package. But after putting it on the tray and adding warm water, it kind of leveled down really nicely. So you don't really need to worry about it being folded when it's shipped to you. The foam is really nice and absorbent, and painting with it with the paper, of course, is really nice. But I think I will be needing to use like a couple on top of each other during the summer. Now let's do a quick size comparison with my Redgrass wet palettes. Now you'll see why I found the Army Painter Classic Wet Palette really cute, because it's really small. Well, small or smaller than the new Redgrass V2 Wet Palette. And of course, the Redgrass XL Wet Palette is also bigger than the XL or no, than the Wargamers Edition. Again, watch until the end of the video as I share with you my initial thoughts of the Army Painter wet palettes, because we tested this by painting a really quick miniature. Initially, I was worried with the wet palette paper because I see videos using the Army Painter wet palette with wrinkled wet palette paper, and I don't like wrinkled paper. Apparently, the paper can be leveled down really neatly on top of the foam. It's just that Thomas of the Army Painter doesn't like fix the wrinkles as much as I did here. Now, before I reveal, a ton of thanks to you guys. The channel is growing. And of course, special thanks to my patrons. Without my patrons, this channel won't be possible. So obviously, I can't really share with you my thoughts if I did not test the wet palette. So I had to test on a quick miniature. I had to paint a quick miniature. I finished off this mini and tested the Warpaints FANATIC on the wet palette. So as I expected, the Warpaints FANATIC works so well with the paper of Army Painter. So the paper is actually very thin and it was very moist. And I must say that these days here in the Philippines, it's like the colder months. So I have to like really see the absorbency or like the quality of the paper and the foam together during the summer months here in the Philippines. But now it works super fine. So since the paper is really thin, thinner than what I'm used to, I had to be careful when I'm like pushing the nozzle of the paints and putting paints on the wet palette. But other than that, it like the painting session worked really well. The painting, the process, the flow, and of course the wet palette worked so well with the Warpaints Fanatic. However, I know Warpaints Fanatic worked so well with the wet palette because I'm pretty sure while Army Painter was developing Warpaints Fanatic, they were using this Army Painter wet palette paper and foam combination. So I had to test this wet palette with other paint brands. Vallejo Game Color, the new Game Color, and Vallejo Model Color work so well with this wet palette. And of course, Cuttlefish Colors work so well. I really like those paints, especially for glazes. And then Two Thin Coats was a charm using this wet palette. And what did I test? I tested Citadels and it worked so well too. But of course, this other brand that I used like a few months ago, it did not work so well because that brand kind of like the pigments and the binders separate so well. Like it was so bad on this wet palette because this paper is so moist. So if your paint brand, the paint brand that you're using is notorious for like separation of pigment and binder, I do not recommend that paint brand. Not this wet palette. I mean, this palette works with all of the other brands except that one brand. So the dissolving, no, not dissolving, the thinning of the paint, especially Warpaints FANATIC, and of course the other brands that I tested, worked like a charm using this wet palette. Because again, the paper is thin, the foam pad is very moist, and that combination kept like the moisture in the paints really well. Now the mixing well, the insert, the white insert is too big. Like it's so big, it's a little bit too much if you're just painting one miniature. But like my daughter Nico reminded me that Army Painter designed this definitely when you're doing army painting. That's their name. Like the Army Painter. So this was designed when you're like specifically if you're painting an army. So basically that ends up like making this mixing wells perfect because it has so many mixing wells. And of course those dish, the wells are so deep you could like mix a ton of washes there or even glazes and even speed paints. So I really like the construction, the design, the quality of the materials, everything in this wet palette. The size is perfect. Especially for me since I'm a messy mixer, paint mixer. Although I do find like the mixing wells a little bit too big, but of course it should be the same size as the Wargamers edition. So that's fine and of course it was designed for specifically I'm sure when you're painting an army. So in comparison to Redgrass, both are really good wet palettes and I highly recommend both of them. But the paper of the Wargamers edition, basically the Army Painter wet palette paper, is thinner. Even the foam is thinner. But that combination works so well for their design. So it's really basically I think it's up to the aesthetics in terms of what you want to like buy or use, but both brands produces really good wet palettes. I'm kind of eager to test this wet palette during the summer here in the Philippines though, because usually during the summer I switch to oil painting because of the hot weather. And oil painting is a little bit more fun than using a wet palette during the summer. That's it, Pansit. I hope you like this video. Until next video, guys. Bye!